hopefully the link that I sent to Kelvin starts working here in just a moment. He's able to join us. But for those of you who don't know, I'm Mark Vanderzijl. I work for Johns Hopkins Tech Ventures, and I have the pleasure of working with a lot of startups and inventors in the area, and we try to put a lot of resources together to make being a startup a little bit easier, knowing it's a big challenge. And one of those efforts we've put on is this panel, which we started last year. One of our other mentors in residence, Skip Colvin, had this great parable about how the successful startup founders aren't great risk takers, they're great risk mitigators. And so hopefully with this panel, we get people who've been there and done that, sharing best practices and maybe pitfalls to avoid to help everybody mitigate some risks. But at the kind of core of what a startup is, I think of a team with a plan and some resources to act on that plan. I know it's exceptionally simple, but without those elements, I think it's going to be very, very challenging to launch any kind of company. So today, our goal was to focus on one resource in particular, a funding mechanism, but importantly, the planning that goes along with that funding mechanism that should happen before you even think about going after these awards and concurrently while you're working through these and progressing your companies. So I've assembled a panel. Again, we've got 2 of the 3 panelists here right now, and hopefully any moment Kelvin's able to get through my Zoom logistics. He says it keeps logging him in as an attendee, so I'll try to keep working through that as I introduce Sarah and Brian. So Brian Lipford's here, one of the founding partners of KeyTech, and Sarah Lee, CEO and co-founder of Relavo. But my hope is that each of you might give your own kind of elevator pitch and introduce yourselves and let everyone know who you are. And we'll start with Sarah. I noticed I invited 3 people with L last names, so I had to go down the line. Sarah is the first in the alphabet here.
Okay, great. Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me here. As mentioned, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Relavo. We are an early stage medical device company that aims to improve the safety and accessibility of home dialysis, specifically peritoneal dialysis, which has been shown to offer patients with kidney failure better health outcomes and quality of life, but is currently underutilized due to a high risk of infection. I began working on this project when I was an undergrad at Johns Hopkins in the biomedical engineering department, starting that capstone design work back in 2017. And then after graduating in 2019 with my BME degree, and then wrapping up a master's also at Hopkins in mechanical engineering, my co-founders and I spun this out into a company and have been full-time on it for the past few years.
Give us a high-level overview of your background and who you are.
Sure. I just realized I need to unmute. So yeah, I was one of the founders of a company called Key Technologies. It's a company that's located in Baltimore. The company is about a little over 25 years old now, and the company primarily develops and creates new medical devices. The company is about 70 engineers, scientists, designers, and primarily the company it's kind of like a fee for service, kind of like a law firm. So companies come to KeyTech, big companies, small companies, and everything in between to develop their medical devices. Part of that, we've also had at KeyTech, we had our own track of products that we would develop, and I oversaw that group as well. And so we had to raise a lot of money ourselves, and we did a lot of work, both through the grants, SBI grants in particular through the NIH, as well as some private equity that we raised to support the inside development programs. I have a BS in mechanical engineering and a master's from Loyola and I've had a professional license degree for over 30 years. I am recently retired from Keytech, so I'm here to hopefully share some of the things that Mark talked about in terms of pitfalls of using some of the grant funding vehicles.
Thanks, Brian. And Kelvin, I'm blaming myself for any of the technical issues and not you, but I'm glad to see you're here.
No, it's probably my work computer has got special permissions and stuff.
Maybe that can be part of your introduction, how you sort of transitioned from being a startup employee to an employee of a larger organization.
Yeah. So let's see. So I'm Kelvin Liu. I went to school at Hopkins. Did a PhD there. Prior to going to Hopkins, I worked for a bunch of small startups in LA, San Diego, and the Bay Area. And so after working for those, I wanted to start my own. So came to Hopkins, did a PhD. After my PhD, I spun out my company called Circulomics, and we were basically a small DNA sequencing company. We were all SBIR funded. That wasn't the original plan, but that's what ended up happening. And so, we took SBIR funding, started selling some products, and then about a year and a half ago, we got bought by a larger DNA sequencing company. So this is a small to mid-cap public company called Pacific Biosciences. So we joined them about summer of 2021. Now we're still located in Baltimore. So I lead our group here in Baltimore, which is now the Technology Development Group. And so we do a lot of sample prep and applications for sequencing for PacBio. And so I lead that group, and then I also lead a lot of our corporate strategy efforts as well.
Thanks, Kelvin. And I chose my background since your company started in the Homewood campus and then Steve Silver building. This is our house location, a stone's throw from Hopkins Homewood campus, and where Fast Forward originally began down the street. One thing about SBIR and STTR awards is, since they're coming from federal agencies, the data is available for anyone to look up awardees and past awards. And at Fast Forward, our team tracks these data rigorously because it helps add some numbers to the anecdotes when we tell the stories of technologies and companies coming out of the university. And to the best of my knowledge, we've seen over 285 SBIR and STTR awards to Hopkins affiliated startups, and it's nearly $160 million. So there's a substantial amount of money that have led to larger companies with follow-on funding, successful exits, and moving technologies forward. So this can be a really impactful award, and hopefully that's something that we address today. But some of the advice from our panel here, before getting a bit too into the weeds, maybe at least a high-level overview and introduction of sort of different funding mechanisms and buckets. And when we describe SBIRs, we often use the term non-dilutive funding. So I thought maybe we'd start with Brian to give an overview of what we mean by non-dilutive funding and how this kind of fits into some of the other mechanisms by which startups may raise capital.
Sure, I'll give it a shot. So in terms of funding mechanisms that are available to the startup, there's generally dilutive, non-dilutive, and debt. So don't need to talk much about debt. That's going to the bank or other financial places and getting a loan. The dilutive, I guess in simple terms, might be, as the startup, you own 100% of your whatever your company is or whatever you're trying to make or your service. If you go and you basically sell a portion of your company to an outside person, they're buying shares in your company. So it's dilutive in that when they buy 20% of your company, your ownership has just been diluted. So when people talk about equity, an equity raise or a dilutive round, they're talking about outside entities that are coming in and buying a portion of your company. They own some, you own less. What's great about the grants is it's non-dilutive, and that basically means it's free money for you in a way, which is just fantastic, a way to build value in your company is through these vehicles, because you can get millions of dollars, like Mark indicated, and it doesn't dilute your position. So it's a great thing all around.
And one quick question for everyone: do you have to pay this back?
No, it's it's a wonderful thing.
Surprisingly, for someone less familiar with this, that is a question that comes up often. Not alone. Sarah, with that kind of high-level introduction, can you give us some of the reasons maybe why you found this type of funding or these types of awards attractive?
Yeah, definitely. So all of the non-dilutive funding opportunities that I really pursued at Relavo, both sort of through different pitch competitions, student grant awards, all of the fast forward funding, and then eventually larger awards like SBIR. It's a great way to make progress on your tech before you're ready to take investment. So a lot of times, even with angel investment, the earliest stage of dilutive funding, you typically need to have some form of traction, either from prototyping, efficacy, certain studies in place, IP filed, and all of that does cost money. So it was a really helpful way to get our company and our technology and our IP in a place that we felt confident that when we were going to angel investors or to small VCs, that we were at the right stage for them. And I think along with a lot of this non-dilutive funding, and especially SBIR, it comes with other mentorship and advising perks that come with it, especially through the National Science Foundation, where we have our SBIRs. It did come with some hours of commercial strategy consulting, more guided I-Corps programs, things like that, and additional support that wasn't just the money.
And if people aren't familiar, I-Corps is a program that was started by the NSF, working with some Stanford faculty to try to apply the scientific method to entrepreneurship. And it is a program that Hopkins is a site of. We have an NSF award for it. And every quarter, we'll take teams through customer discovery, value proposition. So those of you who aren't familiar, anyone interested, follow up with me. It's one of my responsibilities here as well. Kelvin, you mentioned that when you started Circulomics, it may not have initially been the plan to use solely SBIR funds, but you clearly did use some SBIR funding. What made that an attractive vehicle for you?
So I think I guess my main job as founder CEO is to make sure that I can find the resources, whatever those be, whether it's money or space or people, to help move the company along. Right. So I think the first thing I needed to get was dollars to move things from one stage to the next. Right. And so for me, SBIRs was one form of non-dilutive funding that we got, but we actually got some other earlier, kind of easier, even easier to get forms even before that. And then basically, the first award I think we ever got was an E-Team award from NCIA, which is now VentureWell. That was the first small award that we got. That gave us a little something to put on a piece of paper to help us bulk up our credentials. Later on, we got an MTT-CF award from TEDCO. And then later on, we got our first SBIR grants. And then the goal was always to take those small, easier to get fundings and leverage them to get bigger fundings later on that could then move the company along, right? And so the original plan was to get some SBIR funding, move the technology along, and then get some equity funding to further move things more quickly, right? But we actually, even though we didn't end up taking it, we actually had probably 2 or 3 different term sheets. Some from individual local angel investors, some from angel investor groups on the West Coast, right? But I think at each stage, I ended up making the decision that we didn't want to take that money, and then we kept kind of doubling down on the SBIRs, because we were pretty fortunate that over the course of our history we raised a pretty good amount of SBIR funding. So we raised, I think we got close to probably 12 million in SBIR funding, split across a number of phase 1s and phase 2s, all from NIH, that we basically leveraged to get technology to a certain amount, to get certain products out the door, to build certain partnerships. And then so for me, it was always about, if I brought in funding, how would that move the company along to the next stage? And then what funding would get me there fastest, easiest, and with the least headache.
Yeah, without flattering you too much. You're sort of the first name that came to mind when I thought about SBIR awards. Think of
We
you
took a
as
very
a
atypical
guru.
route. We took a very atypical route to go only SBIR funding straight to an exit.
Yeah, but I think it's a compelling story. Brian, do you have any thoughts of some of the pros and cons or reasons why SBIR funding was attractive to you?
I think the short of it is the med tech space, especially now, is really hard. It's darn near impossible to get for a startup who's really just coming out of the gate that like Sarah Lee mentioned, unless you've really built your value proposition and you have some real evidence to back up where you are, it's darn near impossible to get equity funding right now. So it's just a phenomenal way to not dilute like Kelvin said, you're not diluting the ownership position. You're building value in the company. It's just a win-win-win vehicle. So it's yeah, all positive.
Sarah, did you have something to add there? I didn't know if I'm reading into your.
Yeah, I did. So like Brian mentioned, it's kind of it's a tough venture market right now, but even especially with medtech, biotech, and everything, we've really found that investors expect us to have government non-dilutive funding. They want to see that you've leveraged all of those non-dilutive opportunities to advance your tech. And it looks good to have it. I think it also looks bad to not have any non-dilutive funding in the door.
Well, that's an interesting point. I was going to bring it up a bit later, but maybe while we're on the subject, does this provide a bit of validation and notoriety to you when you're going to investors? And is it also attractive to them because they see that that money that you've used to advance your technology, build your team, didn't require you to give up ownership, so that they're not also sharing that?
Yeah, it definitely does provide that validation. I think it's, at least in our experience, fundraising is sort of a balance where investors want to see that you've taken advantage of a lot of the non-dilutive opportunities in front of you, all the government grants, and then also if you are bringing some in while they're also making investments, that brings a lot of value, especially because it means the money they're putting in at the valuation that they're investing in, you can get even further with that because you have that additional government money coming in as well. So they really want to see you be able to get as much done as possible with raising less money, because every subsequent round you raise, it'll dilute your earlier investors. So they like to see that you're bringing in additional non-dilutive funding. And then through NSF in particular, and I believe NIH also has something similar, after getting a phase 2 award, several government agencies will have some form of investment matching where they want to see you raise money from investors. So NSF in particular, if you raise $1 million in equity financing after getting a phase 2, they'll actually provide you with additional non-dilutive funding. So having those opportunities lined up is very attractive to investors as well.
I'm not playing dumb here, but is that phase 3 or is that a different type of?
NSF calls it phase 2B. I believe other agencies might call it phase 3.
It's also attractive to partners and customers too. So like in our space, we work in genomics research. So because of those awards, we've definitely gotten exposure to a lot of KOLs in our space that were very valuable to testing our products and getting them adopted by the kind of genomics community in general. A lot of those collaborations were built on the back of those SBIRs. There's also, and then we have a lot of commercial collaborations that were also built because of those SBIRs. Those companies, like the big life science companies, they also see some of those awards, right? And they see other names on there, and then so those are also attractive in building partnerships as well. One thing I guess nobody talked about, which was your initial question, was there are drawbacks to the funding too. There are drawbacks too. A couple that come to mind quickly are, one is it's pretty slow, right? And so like from the time that you apply to the time that you get the money, best case scenario is oftentimes about a year. It can be longer, right? So it's a fairly slow turnaround. And then there's a lot of rules and stipulations about what you can do with the money, right? There's a lot of allowable and unallowable expenses, right? And so there's a lot of things that are critical to the success of the business that are hard to pay for with SBIR funding, even if you have quite a bit of it. So like IP expenses, or if you want to do marketing, right? Those are all unallowable, right? Those could only come out of the fee that you charge those agencies, right? And that fee, for the NIH, for example, that's 7%. And so you need a lot of money for that 7% to be able to pay for actual IP expenses. And so you have to think very strategically about those other expenses, where they're going to come from, if you're using mainly SBIR funding.
That's good. I'm glad you said that. I did ask for pros and cons, so not only just the good here of SBIR funding. I think a lot of people understandably appreciate non-dilutive ownership and control, but it's important to know some of the drawbacks as well. There was one question, Kelvin, in the Q&A about, is there a limit on how many grants you could apply for? And you were talking about how you can maybe use the funds. Do you, without getting too into the weeds, but do you put specific aims and specific objectives into your application that then dictates how you can use the funds and how many times you can fund the same project or same milestone?
Yeah, well, you can't fund the same project or same milestone twice, right? But what you can do is, or what you want to do even as a business is, you take your core technology, and ideally you can build, a solid product or even a whole product portfolio from that, right? And so in the same way, you can use SBIR fundings to help fund that product portfolio, right? Maybe you have a technology that you use for first application, that could be one grant application put out. And then maybe you make some small modifications to that technology that you use for second application, and then that could be a second grant application. So the funding, we'll have direct funding that you can use to do mainly technical stuff. You can also charge indirect costs that you can use to pay for things like, insurance for your employees. You can pay for rent, pay for the electric bill. And then there's this third bucket of unallowable expenses, which are some things I talked about before, which is like, you can't use the money to hire a sales guy. You can't use the money to pay for IP expenses or licensing costs, right? And so you'll have to think about these, right? And the time at which those expenses come. And what you can do is, much like you build a product portfolio. If I'm going to sell this product here, I'm going to sell this product here, I'm going to sell this product here. You can also build, a grant and research funding portfolio where I have this grant that's going to take me from this time to this time. I'm going to have a second grant that overlaps it, a third grant that overlaps it in time, and I space these out so that you don't have breaks in funding. And that's where you have to be really strategic, because a lot of these grants have long turnaround times. And the phase ones, the dollar amounts are pretty small, so it doesn't get you very far. And so what you really want to do is be able to get those larger phase twos, right? And one way to do that is to apply for phase one, and then after you finish the phase one, do the phase two, right? That's got some benefits and drawbacks. Another way is you can do a fast track where you combine a phase one and a phase two in the same application. But the way that we later did it most often was we just applied direct to phase two. And so we just skip phase one and just take data that we generate from other grants, from other research programs, and just apply directly to the phase two and just do phase twos. And you can do that once you're a little more mature.
Yeah, I'm glad I'm learning something here too as well. By the way, if anyone sees me listed as an SBIR expert on our website, I am an expert facilitator to people who know more about SBIRs. I know enough to be dangerous and to connect people to people who can help. But taking maybe a quick step back before we get a bit too more into the weeds, Johns Hopkins as a university, I know you all have ties or experience at Hopkins, is kind of a grant machine, right? I think for a number of years in a row, Hopkins has been a large recipient of federal research dollars. And I think it's important to make maybe a distinction. I know, Kelvin, you spent time in an academic lab at Homewood, between, let's say, an RO1 award from the NSF or NIH to a PI at the university and an SBIR award to a startup, right? I mean, to me, one of the main distinctions, this maybe will address one of the other questions in the chat, is these are for small businesses, right? These are not for academic researchers. These are federal agencies. Once their budgets get a certain size, they're mandated to carve a portion of that off to promote the advancement of technology and innovation and small businesses in the United States, right? So you have to have a company, and it has to be primarily owned and based in the United States, correct?
Yeah, so as a small company, you can apply to SBIRs, but you can also apply to research grants as well. You can apply to all of them. I think for SBIR, like, yeah, the main stipulations are you have to be a small business, which is less than 500 people, which is actually quite a large business. There
Yeah.
are billion-dollar companies that have less than 500 people. And so, I remember that, I also, there's sometimes you're competing with companies like New England Biolabs, which are large companies. They get SBIRs, they get hundreds of million to $1 billion revenue. You're competing against them, for the same grants. So, as a small business, you can apply to both research grants, R01s, R33s, but also SBIRs, right? But I think the main difference there is kind of what the product is, right? And so with a research grant, the expected product is a paper, right? A paper or publication coming out at the end, right? And then with SBIR, the expected product, at the end of the day, eventually is a tangible product, service or kit or something that you sell, right? And so I think a lot of the skills that you'd use to write a good RO1 versus a good SBIR, they're very similar. The formats are very similar, but the messaging is a little bit different, right? About what needs to come out the back end, right? And so I think, ultimately, to be write a good SBIR, you have to be able to be a good storyteller, right? Make a compelling story about what your company is doing will be a cool product that's really going to push the field forward, right? And be able to do that in as broad terms as possible and to appeal to as many reviewers as possible.
Sarah, do you have something to add? Yeah, so I haven't really had experience with RO1s in the academic setting, and our SBIRs personally came from NSF instead of NIH. So at least on the NSF side as well, they do put a little more of an emphasis on the commercialization plan, which I know is one of the key differentiators between more academic-based grants. You do need to have your business model lined up. You need to have your IP squared away. You need to know how you're going to actually commercialize this product, as opposed to doing more of the basic research.
Yeah, Kelvin, it's a good point that a small business can apply to both types of funding. But hopefully the point I was trying to make is that academic PIs cannot have an SBIR to their lab at Johns Hopkins, right? This is to a startup company.
Yeah. So, Mark, I would building on what Sarah said, the NIH, it sounds like it is a lot like the National Science Foundation in that they have two equal parts of their phase 2 grants, and that is the commercial side and the science side. And you really do have to treat them both with the same value when you're preparing them. And that commercial side, it can take quite a bit of work because they expect you to basically do the market research, have your IP portfolio kind of, you have to discuss that where you are. I mean, they really want to know that you've thought about how you're going to take this thing through development and into commercialization. And you can't just wave your arms because they'll call you on that. You really have to have done your work and developed a real commercialization plan that has the depth and the milestones that you're going to achieve to get it to commercialization. They don't expect you to have it totally fleshed out, but it's not something you're just going to be able to fake either.
Yeah, you and I kind of gone back and forth about the planning work that should happen before you even think about going after funding from any source, right? And in one of our previous panels, we kind of talked about all of the things that can be done before hitting go, right? Before hitting start, when you license a technology or you owe somebody money or you take money from somebody, you need to be ready to act on a plan. So if we stick with Brian for a bit more there, can you think, what are some of the steps that you would encourage people to think of before even going out and applying for some of these awards? You alluded to a few just now. Obviously.
Yeah, I mean, basically, and I don't think this probably comes as a surprise to people, but you really have to have clearly defined the value proposition of this particular venture. Why is it a better mousetrap? And you really have to validate that. It can't be just your gut or, you and your neighbor's gut. You really do need to go out and validate how big that market is. Does the market really want what you're proposing? And can you protect it? All those kind of things. in addition to the value proposition, you really do need to think about what it's going to take to commercialize this thing. You know, your development plan, what kind of milestones you're going to have to hit, and all this. You know, you're going to do it in stages. You're going to put some initial effort into these things with this particular venture that you're going after, and you're going to continue to refine and build on it over time. But you do want to put a skeleton together before you take it too far. And for what it's worth, the thing that I've found time and time again, that, you know, we made this mistake and we saw it again from other people coming into Key Tech, is how well they didn't really validate their value proposition. Either confirming that the market really wanted it, or confirming that the market was big enough to develop to support the kind of investment they were about to put into this venture.
One of the questions I received in advance from someone when they registered is, can you be too early, or how do you know when you're ready? Like, how much data do you have to have, or validation or preclinical studies? If anyone wants to kind of weigh in and know, like, sort of readiness test of, is this type of project ready for an SBIR award?
I can start, I guess. Yeah, I mean, for an SBIR, there's especially phase 1, there's no formal requirement for preliminary data. You don't actually have to have any preliminary data, right? And so, like, there's many different ways of crafting SBIRs, right? And so I think part of the process is you'll have to develop your own formula, your own method, your own tools for evaluating when they're ready, right? And I think different people, you know, a lot of this comes back to your grant writing style, your skill, right? I think the main thing I would stress is, you know, you have to be a good storyteller. That's the most important thing, right? Numbers, like, you know, you know, every company will flash, you know, market numbers. My product can do X this well, you know, X 5 times cheaper, $10 billion market, 2 times, you know, faster, right? Those, I find that, you know, having sat on many SBIR review panels, having written many SBIRs, I find that those things oftentimes aren't terribly compelling, right? And so really, because a lot of the people reviewing the grants, you know, aren't necessarily experts in your exact area, right? So a lot of times those numbers, you know, everyone's going to have numbers that say these kind of things. And so I think a better thing is, you know, when you can have a very compelling story that then resonates with a lot of lay people and lay scientific reviewers, right? And so, you know, having some data is nice, right? But it's often needed, right? It's really hard to actually get grants funded with zero data, right? It's pretty challenging. So it's often nice to have some data, but, you know, having to build a big compelling story about your business, about this product, about why it fits into the niche, I think those things are super important.
So in talks with Brian Stansky at Fast Forward, at times he describes all funding as sort of funding a set of experiments, right? Whether it's a seed, A, B round, you're defining sort of the next validation point or milestone that you want to hit. And if you successfully get any type of this funding and you do the work and you hit some sort of validation point, then you can go out and try to fund the next milestone. I think you've all kind of alluded to either today or in advance about having that plan and define milestones and dates. So I'm wondering, maybe go start with Sarah this time. If you can talk about what went into that when you thought about, you know, I'm going to go after this award. What are the specific objectives that I identify internally in my company and specifically in the application?
Yeah, I think going across all funding, you need to really look for where you can add value to the company. So when we were approaching our phase 1 award a few years ago, we were thinking, what is the highest risk part of our device that we think we can get funding for? And for us, that was toxicity risk. That was around safety to the patient. Sort of thinking about, if this fails, the whole product will fail, and that's what we want to address first. And thinking that once we can demonstrate that our disinfectant solution is safe to patients, it's non-toxic, then we can move forward with the rest of it. And the same thought process goes into the way that we structure our equity fundraisers, thinking about where where we can add value to the company, where those critical milestones are going to be. For example, submitting to FDA, getting a first clinical trial done, getting FDA clearance, really thinking about what we need to do to achieve these milestones. And with SBIR funding, it's sort of not only what are the highest risk activities that are ahead of me in the product development pathway, but also what do I need to get done to be at a stage where angel investors are going to be interested, and then figuring out how I can get grant funding to achieve those milestones.
Kelvin, you told me that it's important to think about how this funding actually progresses, either technology or your company. How are you maturing and moving forward rather than just being a grant mill? Like, can you elaborate on how you think about it?
Yeah, I think like Sarah said, I tend to like to plan, right? So I'll try to figure out, hey, where do I need the company to be in the next 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, and then come up with a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C to get us there, and then figure out, then how I'm going to pay for those things to get us there, right? So some of those things are technical milestones, right? So we can take the SBIR funding and say, hey, I need to do this to get this technology far enough that I could go approach a contract manufacturer to make this thing for me that I can then start selling. And that could be one way we use the funding. Second way we could leverage the funding is, hey, I'm going to build a collaboration with this KOL that's going to test my new product and be the first customer, and then then we can go out and talk to other people together. And a third way, is we could say sometimes on SBIRs I'll bring in a commercial collaborator, like say, hey, I'm going to partner with Thermo to do the validation on this, or partner with this other company or Pacific Biosciences to do this, right? And then that gets a partner involved, right? And so I think there's many ways you can take that funding and leverage it to move you on to your next business milestone, right? And that's basically what we did, right? At every point, we had a lot of options. We had a few opportunities to take in equity funding, but we chose to, hey, I think we can do this bootstrapping as well. And so we bootstrapped to getting our first product out the door, bootstrapped to getting commercial partnerships, bootstrapped to then selling our first product, and then our second product, and our third product, and then we just kind of went from there. And eventually, once we did that, then we started making enough money that we could pay for some of these things ourselves. So like Sarah said, it's always kind of about identifying what your next milestones need to be, and then trying to figure out strategically how you can use different tools available for you to get you there.
Brian, does that sound like a bit what you were describing ahead of today about how you have to think of dates and milestones and objectives when you're planning for these awards and when you're going after them?
Yeah, I think everything that Sarah and Kelvin just said is spot on. It's kind of like trying to make up a 3-year plan. So the value of the 3-year plan is probably worthless, but the process of you having to sit down and think about it is what's golden, because you got to force yourself and sit and think about everything that's in front of you. And you're probably going to need to put some people around you that might have experience in some of those areas to help you do it. But it can be a very long and difficult road. And so you really have to try to think about everything you have in front of you. And then, like Sarah said, and it's the same thing that we do at KeyTech, we try to create a risk-based kind of model. What are the highest risk things that I need to take on, even if it's not what I want to do? What I really want to do is I want to go make a cool widget, because I can picture in my head exactly what that widget's going to be. But that may not be what you should be doing. So maybe what you should be doing is making sure you really understand the assay and everything that could go wrong with that assay before you go building a widget. And I'm not saying that's the case, but the message is really sit down and try to think through what you've got in front of you so you can figure out how you want to attack it.
Just one thing to add here as well, kind of going off of what Kelvin was saying about where do I want my company to be in 6-12 months. The other thing with grants that was mentioned earlier is that it's a very long process between writing the proposal, having the agency review it, and actually getting the award. So as you're going into the plans, it's important to also have contingency plans. You likely aren't going to be awarded every grant you apply for, and if you don't get the award, that's almost 12 months of prep and review time that have already passed. So you need to be really thinking far in advance, since you're applying to grants that you're probably not going to see the money for 12 months. and what are you going to get done in that 12-month review period, and then what are you going to get done when you actually get the grant.
A few of the questions in the chat are maybe related to how you can use the funds, and I think some of you have alluded to that earlier. At a high level, my understanding is the distinction between an SBIR and STTR is with an SBIR, you can work with organizations like Kelvin mentioned, like Thermo Fisher, or with like a nonprofit research organization, whereas an STTR actually requires you to collaborate with a nonprofit research organization. But in the chat, people asked for, can you use an SBIR to pay for clinical trials? Can it be used to work with academic labs? So do any of you have experience with that or want to try to address those questions?
I can give it a start. So on the clinical trials side, it really depends on the solicitation. And NIH in particular does differentiate which proposal solicitations are allowable for clinical trials and which ones clinical trials are not allowed on, so just pay attention to that. I believe NSF will not fund clinical trials, so it's something else to keep in mind as well. For academic labs, I think on an SBIR, for the SBIR, the award is made to the company itself. You could sub-award and work with an academic lab. I don't have a ton of experience there though, so I might defer to others.
Kelvin or Brian, have either of you worked with an academic lab?
So we primarily have used the SBIR model through the NIH. And like Sarah said, some of them will fund clinical trials, preclinical and clinical, and we've done both through SBIR funding. But you do have to look at to make sure that the particular grant you're going after will allow it. And you know, it is great in the SBIR model. You have a lot of freedom to use the money to achieve your objectives. They're not going to look over your shoulder and see how you're spending your money. There are a couple of limits, I think, on the SBIR model. If you want to sub out work, and again, you're only talking maybe 150, 200,000 max, at least I don't know what it is now. But I think there was a limit of like 1/3 of your funding you could use to sub out to get outside help. And I think that goes up to like 50% in the phase 2, but still you have limits, and they expect you as the company to do the lion's share of the work. I mean, this is your company. They don't want to basically have you outsource everything. That's not the reason they're setting up these vehicles. So I guess that gets a little bit back to, you know, who the company is. You're setting up a company to develop these products and you're using their money to do it. But they do expect you to do the lion's share.
One thing, you know, we don't do anything clinical. We're RUO, kind of research tools company, but you know, all of the grants that I had, you know, they were almost always in collaboration with academics. So we had many subcontracts back to Hopkins, back to other academic institutes. It's very useful when you're writing your first grants. It's very useful if you're doing any clinical research, right? Because you know the grants largely get evaluated. You know, the most important thing that they get evaluated on is their significance and their impact. You know, those are the two things that are the most important for most reviewers. And then another important thing is kind of, you know, how likely it is to succeed, right? You know, they're not going to fund things that they don't think are going to work, right? And so how likely that's going to succeed is going to be based on a couple of things, right? One is, you know, the technology and, you know, how well, you know, how plausible it seems, how impactful it seems, right? But another thing is going to be the team, right? And so, you know, your company is, you know, especially if you're small, you know, you're not going to have experts in every single area that you need, right? So you need to beef that up. And so one way to do that is with collaborators, right? And so, you know, if I'm developing, you know, a new sequencing method to look at cancer tests, you know, they're going to want to see, hey, you've got some cancer expert on there, right? And so you can go find some expert at Hopkins, of which there are many, and ask them, hey, do you want to collaborate with me on this? You know, we'll do this. You know, we can help pay for some of the materials costs if you want to come test our method, and then you can write a grant together. And so we did that many times across many different technologies, and we've got, you know, a lot of great collaborators we worked with at Hopkins. And I think that's one of the best, you know, if you're doing med tech, biotech stuff, one of the great things about working with Hopkins. There's just so many people doing such great research that you can find a lot of good partners to help you with on the back end of your grants.
Kelvin, if we stick with you for a minute, you mentioned the story earlier. How have you tried to, or have you tried to align the language that you put into your application with any sort of solicitation for applications, or have you worked with any of the agency like program managers to kind of understand what they are looking to fund?
Yeah, so you can okay, so when you apply to the grants, there's a few different ways that you can do it, right? You can apply to program announcements, RFAs, or the general omnibus solicitation. It's important to distinguish because like grants will go through a few different stages of reviews, right? So I've only done NIH, so this is primarily NIH. So if you submit a grant to NIH, it's first going to go to a review panel, right? Those review panels can be of two types. They can either be kind of, for SBIRs, there aren't official standing panels, but they're kind of effectively kind of standing panels that are kind of grouped by subject area, right? And so there'll be some professors and academics on there that are generally experts in that subject area, and they'll reconvene every quarter to review all the grants of that general subject area. And so things that go to the omnibus submissions or to program announcements, even if there's topic-specific program announcements, will generally go to those kind of committees, right? RFAs, in contrast, those they'll assemble specific groups of people just to review grants for those RFAs, right? And so when you apply to those, you want to think a little bit about who's reviewing it to know which mechanism is the best, right? But at the end of the day, the people making the decisions are the program managers, right? And so every institute has different ways that it funds grants. Some will publish a hard cutoff, above, if you score below this, better than this, we'll fund all of it. If you score above this, then you're in the gray area, right? And so there's a very wide gray area, right? Because it's very hard to evaluate grants, right? It's very hard to tell the difference between, a grant that's super good, just a little bit worse, and a little bit worse, right? But there's a lot of chance in there, right? And so what happens there, the program managers have to come in and then they look at those things. Maybe your grant scored a 30 or 35 or 40. In reality, there's not much difference between those, right? And so what the program managers have to do is they have to look at those grants and figure out, hey, I see these are all scored within this gray area range. Which are the ones that are most interesting to the scientific community, to my institute, right? To holes in our portfolio, and then they'll pick those to fund, right? And so this is where it's very useful to really get to know the program manager as well, right? That has a few benefits. One is you can learn what's important to the institute, right? Two, you can get the feedback, from them sometimes about, hey, what part of, the research you're proposing could be stronger, could be weaker, right? They can take a look at that, give you some guidance, but they are very, very helpful, right? And most of them are very, very nice, right? So if you've never done it before, I would highly recommend, building a relationship with those program managers. So we knew some of the program managers quite well, and they're very helpful, right? But we wouldn't be here today without them, right? They helped introduce us to a lot of collaborators. They helped us introduce us to, new programs we could apply to. It was very, very helpful.
Sarah or Brian, in the time we have left, do you have anything to add to what Kelvin was just speaking about, or have you worked with anyone to help you prepare an application?
Yeah, I want to echo what Kelvin said about really knowing the program officers, program directors, since they can be really, really helpful in making sure and helping. They won't tell you how to write your research goals, but they can help you give tailor some of the language, tailor some of the approaches to make sure you're framing things in a research appropriate way for the purposes of the grant. As far as preparing the actual proposal goes, when I was applying to our phase 1 grant, that was the first government grant I ever interacted with. I didn't do any grant writing in undergrad. So it was all new, and it can be kind of daunting just based on navigating all of the different government accounts you need and all of that. So I went through the TEDCO SBIR Proposal Lab program, and I found that really helpful, actually, especially since I didn't have any exposure to government grants before. So it was all new, and that program sort of walked through all the accounts we needed to do, what all the steps were for the NSF process, connected us with different SBIR reviewers to give feedback on our drafts. So I would definitely recommend looking into that, especially if you are new to grants. After the first time around, going into our phase 2 proposal, and then an NIH one that we submitted recently, we mostly did that ourselves. We had a few advisors give feedback on drafts, but we haven't worked with any external writing consultants.
Brian?
Yeah. So yeah, I guess just adding on, I agree with everything that Kelvin and Sarah said. We tried a couple times to work with outside writers, and we weren't very successful. I understand that there are good ones out there. We just didn't. I think we knew our topic better than anyone else, and we felt comfortable doing the writing, so we did. There's a lot of examples out there that you can find of grants, and if you decide you're going to go down that path, I highly recommend that you look at those and study them. They'll give you lots of tips on how to write your statements of what you're trying to get done. I guess the only thing that I would offer for people that are thinking about this is the successful companies are the ones that are tenacious, because chances are you're not going to be successful the first time. You'll get some great comments. You'll rewrite based on the comments you get from the reviewers, and then you'll probably be successful, or you will be successful at some point. Just again, be tenacious, and the money's there, and it can really help you.
If anyone in the audience has some questions later about who could help with grant support, reach out to me. I'll follow with all the everyone who registered before by email after this, so you can get in touch with me. In the last few minutes we've got here, I'm wondering if each of you could share something that you know now that you wish you knew when you started this process of SBIRs. You start with Sarah.
I would say don't cram too many research goals into one grant. I think something that we've learned, especially since when we started this out, I was fresh out of undergrad. We were a little too ambitious in what we were proposing for some of the awards, and realizing that the 250,000 doesn't go as far as you think it's going to go. So I would definitely advise people, if they're new to grants, to work closely with advisors, work with other mentors to make sure what you're proposing is realistic. And I think that's something we were able to better adjust for in future grant proposals. But as sort of a beginner's tip, that's definitely something that we struggled with in the first proposal.
Brian, any lessons learned from you?
Yes, similar to what Sarah said. Be realistic, because when you figure out what you want to do, try to draw a really clear box around it with very clear, very objective endpoints. Like, I'm going to show that when I run this assay, it's, the number that's going to come out is 5.5. The clearer you can make your end objectives, they like that. And so be realistic, be very defined in your goals. And if you find that you really need, let's say on this particular grant, they say that the ceiling should be 200,000 for a phase 1, or whatever, 2 million for a phase 2. And you find that the scope of work that you really need to do, you've carved it down as much as you can, but you really need to do this particular scope exactly like this, and it's going to cost 250,000 or 2.2 million. You can ask for that. These limits that they have, I mean, if you reach out to the program manager and say, I really need to do this, and it's going to cost a little bit more, that program manager will tell you whether he or she thinks it's okay. And in our cases, it's always been okay. So figure out exactly what you need to do, find out exactly how much money you're going to need, and then press for that money.
Kelvin, other than jumping straight to phase 2, what are some of the other lessons you learned?
I think I would personally, I think the thing I learned most was just to be a better storyteller. I'm going to go back to that, because I think as a scientist, I tend to be very quantitative, right? But it's just, those things are not very compelling, right? Most of the people, they'll see those numbers all day, right? So you really have to craft a compelling story about why your company, your product is really awesome, right? That can really resonate with people, right? When we go, like, as consumers every day, when we go make purchasing decisions, we don't always buy or fund, buy the things that make the most sense, right? Or we all be driving Toyota Camrys or Corollas, right? Which is clearly not the case, right? So, sometimes you make things that, that are more exciting. This program sounds a lot more exciting. There's subjective people that are reviewing the grants, making these funding decisions, right? So you have to be able to sell your science, with a compelling story that resonates with lots of people.
Well, I know we got just a slight late start, but we are at the top of the hour and want to let everyone get on with their days. So I'd really like to thank Sarah and Brian and Kelvin for your time today, sharing your stories. I will make sure this recording gets added to our sort of growing online library, digital library at JHTV. I'll reach out to all the registrants with the link afterward and any follow-up materials. But thank you guys for your time today. Anyone in the audience, look for future upcoming panels on different topics. And if you have suggestions, send them to me and I'll see if we can put a panel together. We'd like to grab people who have, who can use first-person pronouns and action verbs and tell us what they've actually done themselves. So that's what this forum is for. All right. Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate your time. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Great. Thanks.